There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, be without food, but don't be without shelter or home. Shelter is very important than food, I was working as much as you can work, like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dennis Shay, and I am the Executive Director of the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. At the Terwilliger Center, we are guided by the core belief that every family deserves a decent, safe, and affordable home to live. The center works to advance bipartisan legislation that addresses our nation's most pressing housing challenges. As housing costs reach unprecedented levels amid a shortage of affordable homes, preserving the existing stock of affordable housing is more important than ever. Today, a panel of experts from across the country will talk about current tools to preserve housing, as well as proposals for new strategies. But before our panel discussion, we are thrilled to have with us today Congressman Darin LaHood, who represents Illinois' 16th district, which spans 21 counties across central and northwestern Illinois. The congressman serves on the powerful House Ways and Means Committee and is chair of the Subcommittee on Work and Welfare, as well as a member of the Subcommittee on Trade. While serving on Ways and Means, Congressman LaHood has introduced several bills to reduce families' housing costs and strengthen affordable housing opportunities in communities across the country. So, Congressman, really thrilled to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, Dennis, thank you. And I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Committee for having me on today and for the opportunity to discuss the important topic of affordable housing.
Well, great. I mean, throughout your 4 terms in Congress, you've made affordable housing, expanding access to quality, affordable homes, really a top legislative priority. Why is housing such an important policy area for you?
Well, as we've seen all across the country, Dennis, housing shortages and affordable housing is really at a crisis period. And it is a rural issue, a suburban issue, and an urban issue, as you well know. And so for me, really access to housing is one of those important stepping stones that can lead to many benefits in our communities. And I've seen that firsthand. Everybody on this call knows, housing can be what it takes for a struggling parent to get back on their feet. It can cultivate workforce in a growing community, and it can start a trend of economic development in areas desperate for new businesses. Additionally, as you mentioned, Dennis, the affordable housing crisis we are seeing is being felt in communities throughout Illinois and obviously throughout the country. Not only is supply down by about 5 million rental units from where we need to be right now, but 12 million renter households nationwide pay more than half of their monthly income on rent, leaving too little for other expenses, of course, like healthcare, childcare, food, and transportation. So the return on investment by prioritizing pro-growth housing policy is really a no-brainer from my perspective. And so I've enjoyed being engaged with my colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee and through other dialogue and partnerships in the House and Senate to try to raise this to a level where we can get some positive outcomes.
I mean, your district covers urban, rural, and suburban communities, correct? So you've seen the housing affordability challenge in all three venues. Is that correct?
No doubt about it. My district is kind of central Illinois up to the Wisconsin border. So I have kind of the excerpts of Chicago, and then a lot of rural farmland throughout central and northern Illinois, and then some medium-sized cities like Peoria, Bloomington Normal, Rockford. And so you see that mix and dichotomy of housing needs in all three of those areas.
Well, for better part of this year, the Ways and Means Committee has been working in individual tax teams to take a very close look at the various parts of the tax code ahead of the expiration of much of the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. And Congressman, in addition to leading the American Workforce tax team, you're also a member of the Community Development tax team, which is heavily focused on housing and local economic development. So could you share with us how these tax teams have been going and talk about the specific proposals that have come up in the community development tax team, particularly affordable housing and preservation?
Well, sure, Dennis. In anticipating the kind of Super Bowl of tax, which we'll have in 2025, the Ways and Means Committee has been fully engaged over this past year with 10 tax teams, as you mentioned. Chairman Jason Smith has put together these tax teams with really a couple goals in mind. One is to educate members of Congress on what's about ready to happen next year, talking about budget reconciliation, which will be the legislative mechanism most likely that tax reform will take place in. And then also hearing from the private sector, hearing from our constituents. We did a number of field hearings across the country to get feedback on what's worked in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act bill back in 2017, maybe what hasn't, what can be revised or changed. And so we've been hard at work doing that. You mentioned a couple that I serve on. I would also just remind people, Dennis, that 40% of the Republicans will be in the House next year weren't here when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 was passed. And so there's an important education component of this that we're working on. Additionally, we recognize the country has gone through significant changes since 2017, with certain areas such as affordable housing becoming a much bigger issue than it was in 2017. You mentioned the Community Development Tax Team. That's been led by Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania, my colleague. I also serve on there. We've been looking at how do we strengthen tax tools that incentivize affordable housing and economic growth in our communities. Also within that portfolio, Dennis, of the Community Development Tax Team, we're looking at historic tax credit. We're looking at opportunity zones there and starter homes for first-time home buyers. We've had some great discussions on the importance of both the low-income housing tax credit and the historic tax credit that in some ways go hand in hand depending on the community that you're in. We've I think put together a pretty good consensus, at least among the tax team members, that strengthening both of these programs can play a significant role in spurring economic growth and satisfying the need of more affordable housing.
Well, that's great. I know you mentioned Congressman Kelly. He's been involved in the BPC projects as well, and he's the lead sponsor of the neighborhood homes Investment Act, which is another tax credit that would support private investment in starter homes for sale. So it's really great to hear all this work that's going on behind the scenes, and understand that there's a steep learning curve for many members who were not here in 2017. But as you know, the low-income housing tax credit is our primary tool to create and preserve affordable rental housing for low-income families. And you introduced HR 3238, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, to expand and modernize the low-income housing tax credit program. So as you know, at BPC, we're strong proponents of the bill and believe it will spur the production of hundreds of thousands of much-needed new affordable rental homes. This seminar is about preservation. Could you just briefly mention how you think your bill would also help preserve existing affordable homes?
Well, sure. First of all, let me thank BPC for your advocacy and what the center continues to do to support our legislation. I mean, as you mentioned, the low-income housing tax credit will play a significant role in terms of filling in the gaps that we need with affordable housing, low-income housing, and what I also call workforce housing, which is essential to getting our economy back on track. We introduced our bill at the beginning of the Congress. We have 270 co-sponsors on it. But at one time it was half Republicans, half Democrats. There's a few more Democrats, but not many. It is the most bipartisan piece of tax legislation currently introduced in the Congress. I know that's a low bar in some people's view, bipartisan tax legislation, but nonetheless, it shows the broad bipartisan support on both sides with varying ideological differences with members of Congress. But it will play a significant role in terms of bridging that gap of affordable housing. And there's been a lot of focus on the LIHTC space and on the development of new rental units. With new rental units, you can make important points that these credits can also be used for the acquisition and rehabilitation of existing affordable units as well. That's part of our bill. And our bill would expand the number of credits available for states to issue, which will help diversify the types of projects receiving the benefit and make it more attractive for developers to utilize the credit for the preservation and rehabilitation of already existing units instead. And Dennis, as you know, our legislation was included in the Smith-Wyden bill that passed earlier this year on the House floor. We had 350 bipartisan votes, passed overwhelmingly, went over to the Senate, and unfortunately, because of politics and not policy, we didn't get it done. So that's unfortunate, but I think it sets a good tone and a good precedent for us going into next year.
Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, you mentioned a few numbers there, 270 co-sponsors. I've been in Washington for quite some time. I don't recall any piece of legislation that has 270 co-sponsors from both political parties. So I really applaud you for herding the cats and getting them on the bill and really building up such a wonderful support. I also want to remind the audience that your legislation, as I understand, would lead to the creation and rehabilitation of almost 2 million affordable rental homes over the next 10 years. So that's a really big number. It's not going to solve the supply shortage, but it will make a major step in the right direction and help fill a much needed gap. So very much applaud you. You know, I go from meeting to meeting, Congressman. We're wondering, is the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act going to be part of next year's tax bill, which I understand is going to start, you know, the work's going to be pretty quick out of the chute come January. So, I mean, do you expect the LIHTC, your bill, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, to be part of next year's budget reconciliation tax package? And how would you assess its prospects to get over the legislative finish line?
Well, the answer is yes. You know, this housing crisis has not gone away. It was an issue talked about on both sides of the aisle throughout the campaign at the congressional and senatorial level. And so it's front and center with what members have been hearing back home. You couple that with the fact, as we just talked about, Dennis, the bipartisan nature of the bill, the fact that it's been around for a long time, started under Ronald Reagan, and you bring out the tax credit when there is a need. And clearly there is a need now, as I mentioned, in urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas. And you couple that with the fact that we had broad bipartisan support on it from lots of different members. And so I think that sets the tone going into next year. Listen, I wish we had passed it earlier this year and it was law and being utilized because we need it. But I think as I sit on the Ways and Means Committee and I have conversations with my colleagues, and as we look at how do we be attentive to the issues that the American people care about, housing is one of those. And so our tax team that worked on this will be putting forth proposals to be included next year as we look at this. And as you referenced, Dennis, this will be the first thing out of the gate. We'll be trying to get this done in the first 100 days, our tax bill and the LIHTC provision, or as you mentioned, the AHCIA has to be a part of that. And so I remain optimistic, but we're going to have to collectively be engaged in this process from all sides.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman, for that positive prognosis. And we're here to stand to support you and really applaud your efforts to support low-income housing and support housing affordability across the country. So really appreciate your efforts. Now it's my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Terwilliger Center Senior Analyst Kristen Clearfield, who will have a distinguished group of panelists to discuss other efforts at affordable housing preservation. Kristen?
Well, thank you, Dennis, and thank you to Congressman LaHood for taking the time to be with us today and offering those insights. We really appreciate it. For the remainder of our webinar, we'll have a facilitated discussion about preservation. We'll have a panel of 3 policy experts to discuss federal programs that support preservation, including the Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD, as well as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program that the Congressman was talking about. We'll also examine the scope of the problem in rural America and highlight some proposals for reform. And to join this conversation, we are delighted to have with us today Sarah Bronin, the chair of the U.S. Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. While chairing the Advisory Council, she is on leave from her tenured position at Cornell University, where she serves as professor in the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, and as an associate faculty member of the law school. Sarah founded Desegregate Connecticut, which advanced statewide zoning reforms. She launched the National Zoning Atlas to digitize zoning codes nationwide, and is the author of the newly released book, Key to the City: How Zoning Shapes Our World. Thank you for being with us, Sarah. Next, we're joined by Mark Kudlowitz. Mark is a senior policy director at the Local Initiatives Support Corporation, or Lisk, where he advocates for policies that support Lisk's national priorities, including affordable housing, rural development, community development, financial institutions, and sustainability. Mark previously worked as the policy director of HUD's Office of Multifamily Housing Programs and at the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund at the Treasury Department. Mark managed affordable housing and community development programs at the District of Columbia's Department of Housing and Community Development, and held multiple positions at the Housing Assistance Council, a national rural affordable housing organization. Our third panelist today is Sarah Mulseed, Acting Deputy Director of HUD's Office of Recapitalization. In this capacity, Sarah works on policy development and implementation of the Rad Program and the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, as well as assisting with complex transactions and cross-cutting issues at the agency. Sarah also served as Housing Senior Advisor and the Acting Director of the Multifamily Investments Division with the Office of Recapitalization. Prior to joining HUD, Sarah was the Executive Director of the Western Reserve Revitalization and Redevelopment, Inc., which is the nonprofit development arm of the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority in Cleveland, Ohio. Well, thank you 3 for being here. I also want to encourage our virtual audience today to submit your questions at any point for our panelists by using the chat function in YouTube. We'll be sure to save some time at the end of our discussion for audience Q&A. Okay, so let's get into it. Sarah Mulseed, I'd like to start with you. HUD's Office of the Preservation and Recapitalization of Federally Assisted Housing in our country. Can you give us a breakdown of that office's top priorities when it comes to preservation?
Sure. So as you mentioned in my bio, we have in the Office of Recapitalization, we administer a few different programs. The two primary ones are the Rental Assistance Demonstration and the Green Resilient Retrofit Program. The rental assistance demonstration has been kind of the office's bread and butter for the last 10 years. Rad has been around for about a decade now. And through that program, we convert subsidy from a public housing platform or a multifamily platform that is renewed on an annual basis into a long-term Section 8 contract. And that really does allow those properties to access private capital and to perform recapitalizations with resources that are not available when they have only the federal subsidies and are in the either public housing program or the Section 202 program or Section 811 program. And so through that and through other smaller kind of more legacy programs such as the mark-to-market program in the Section 8 project-based rental assistance context, we really are focused on helping properties build their toolboxes and figure out how we can recapitalize, how we can address deferred maintenance, which tends to be a huge issue for preservation properties, and how we can make them move forward so that they're affordable and sanitary, decent, good housing for the residents that live there now and the residents that can live there in the future as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And we'll be getting into RAD in more detail during this conversation as well. So thank you for previewing that. Sarah Bronin, would love to turn to you now. You are the chair of the U.S. Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is an independent federal government agency dedicated to historic preservation. Can you tell us and the audience about the agency's mission and how it's carried out?
Sure. And thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for convening this really important conversation. I am so glad to be here to talk about preservation because I do think it is a key strategy to creating and providing housing and affordable housing across the country. So our agency is the independent federal agency that focuses on historic preservation issues. We have, I would say, two main responsibilities. The first is to oversee a rather expansive regulatory review process that sweeps under our purview about 120,000 federal agency actions annually, including every housing unit that the federal government builds and every housing unit that the federal government funds or finances or permits. So if you think about our scope, since the agency was created in the 1960s, we've pretty much had a hand in reviewing all of these actions that are taking place in, let's say, HUD housing or in federal government office to housing conversions or community development block grants that are given to states and local governments for housing. So a large amount of housing rehabilitation falls under our agency's purview, as some of the many types of activities that we cover in our review process. In addition to that regulatory process, we have, as our name suggests, an advising function. So we are tasked with advising the president and Congress, other federal agencies, as well as state and local governments on historic preservation policy. And one of the areas where we've recently done that is in the area of housing. So those are our two main functions. It's a very small agency, but in my view, pivotal in being part of the solution that we're talking about today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Mark, I'd love to turn to you now and hear a little bit about Lisk. And while Lisk's work ranges across many areas, including early childhood development, healthcare, the financing of affordable housing has really been at the core of your business model for quite some time, as I understand it. And so with that, how does Lisk promote affordable housing preservation? And does your financing include preservation support?
Yes, it does. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Lisk is a national affordable housing and community development nonprofit. We work in 38 local offices across the U.S. and also have a couple of affiliated entities that utilize the low-income housing tax credit, which is our national equity fund, We also have an affiliate called Lisk Fund Management that it manages off-balance sheet and does fund management activities typically for localities. A lot of that, excuse me, is for preservation. And then Lisk itself is a community development financial institution, or CDFI. So that's right, Kristen, we're primarily providing debt and equity for affordable rental housing projects. And we know that over the last, especially 5 years, affordable housing preservation needs have become much more pronounced. We have higher operating costs at a lot of properties, but unfortunately have had a relative decrease in subsidies, which is why it's so important. And we're such big fans of Representative LaHood's Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, because we desperately need more credits to be able to preserve both housing credit properties that have their own preservation needs at this point as the program has aged, and for the federally assisted stock that Sarah is talking about, in which they assist through the Rad program. Many of our local offices throughout our 38 local office network also administers preservation-focused funds, including our DC Lisk office right here in the nation's capital. We're also thrilled that there's some new adjacent sources to be able to help with preservation efforts. Lisk was thrilled to receive a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund award in our Power Forwards Communities collaboration, where Lisk is joining hands with the nation's other national affordable housing nonprofits, enterprise community partners, Habitat for Humanity, and then partners at the United Way and Rewiring America, where we'll have new subsidy that we'll be able to blend in for preservation transactions that will help decarbonize existing affordable rental housing, making those properties not only just more energy efficient, but also healthier for the tenants that reside in them.
Excellent. Well, that sounds like an exciting opportunity. And we'll also be talking a little bit about the sustainability aspect of preservation during our conversation today, too. But I would love to talk about recent efforts at the federal level that show the importance of preservation. And Sarah Bronin, I'll turn to you for this question. As we've mentioned, the U.S. has an aging housing stock. I believe about half of our existing housing units have been built before 1979. And I know that the Advisory Council has been exploring the idea in the role that the rehabilitation of historic buildings could play in our national housing shortage and helping to alleviate that shortage. And about a year ago, in December 2023, the Advisory Council adopted an official housing and historic preservation policy. So would love to hear what that policy is, and whether there are any systems or you've have been thinking about how to monitor whether some of these policy goals are being carried out locally.
Yes, that housing and historic preservation policy statement was an extremely collaborative process where we worked with the members of the council, there are 24 of those, to come up with a series of guiding principles for our work as an agency and guiding principles for how we will advise others, as well as how we will amend our own regulatory process that's called, by the way, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. They call it the Section 106 process. And so that policy statement included provisions like the need to collect data to understand how historic designation and affordability work together, or maybe don't work together. The need to reform our Section 106 processes so that we can have clearer and more straightforward and standard and consistent rules across housing projects that federal agencies are trying to do. We include in that policy statement support for the kinds of tax credits that Congressman LaHood was speaking about, including, most importantly, the Historic Preservation Tax Credit, which has funded billions and billions of dollars of activity in the last year alone and generated investments in communities. Underlying all of that, I think, is this idea that preservationists know how to rehab buildings for a lot of different uses. They are creative, they are resourceful, they can bring a building back to life. And given huge changes in our society, particularly post-COVID, as we've seen office buildings maybe be more vacant than some would like, as we see manufacturing continue to ebb and flow in some communities, we have opportunities to take those office buildings, to take those manufacturing buildings, to take federal government buildings and repurpose them for this important aim of providing housing. So from an agency perspective, the passage of that policy set the template, laid the groundwork for everything that the agency has done since, and everything that the agency will continue to do into the next administration. Because again, as Congressman LaHood pointed out, this is a bipartisan issue. No matter who is in the White House or who is in Congress, there's widespread recognition that housing is a need that is at present, is evident in all of our communities. So I'm looking forward to see how the council continues to move that forward, but very proud that we have really put a very strong position statement out there and that our work is being guided by that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that explanation. And we will certainly be monitoring that as well. Mark, as we think about, moving policy from the federal level to the local level, you mentioned your organization operates not just federally, but also throughout the country through your 38 offices nationwide, in addition to those partner network organizations. And Lisk has home repair programs that operate through these local offices. What types of assistance does Lisk provide as part of these home repair programs? And how does it help folks preserve their housing?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Like I mentioned, Lisk takes a very comprehensive approach to preservation. So we're primarily known for our affordable rental housing work, both in terms of the debt and equity that we're able to provide through the low-income housing tax credit and our affiliate. But many of our local offices do support home repair programs. That really started around a little over 10 years ago with our Detroit office. They offer a zero-interest loan program that's supported by both private dollars and some public money from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We're able to provide, I think we've already done over 800 home repair loans to low-income households in the city. These are loans that you really could not be able to access through a bank. And these are really designed to address safety code violations, repairs, other general repairs at the property. And why this is so vitally important, obviously, is that this is both a housing stability strategy to keep low-income homeowners in their home and in a safe environment, but it's also an asset building approach, right? These properties typically represent the largest asset for these households and are a source of equity that can be provided from one generation to the other, allowing families to be able to meet their individual goals. We have expanded our home repair programmatic activity to other Lisk local offices, including Memphis, Cincinnati, and Cleveland. We've also quickly want to address heirs property, which is another homeownership preservation strategy that Lisk is really focused on. And with heirs property, that occurs when there are multiple owners and not a clear title to property. It's been conservatively estimated there's around $32 billion worth of properties that does not have clear titles that primarily are for households who are BIPOC or have lower educational attainment or a lower income. That has really profound implications for these multiple owners because you can't access a mortgage, you can't typically access government assistance programs after a disaster, and prevents the transfer of property within a family. And so our Lisk Jacksonville office has been a real leader on this, partnering with legal aid organizations to better understand this issue. It's in both urban and rural communities. And to date, they've assisted over 185 households resolving title issues. So that's what we've done at the practitioner level. At the policy level, real quick, I just wanted to give a big plug to the HEIRS Act, which is a bill that's led by Representative Williams, Cleaver, and Fletcher that would establish a new program at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to provide assistance for legal aid organizations working on heirs title resolution. And also want to give a big tip of the hat as well on another bipartisan bill called the Whole Homes Repair Act that Senator Fetterman and Senator Lummis are leading, which would also authorize a new program at HUD to provide critical home repair resources. We don't have a dedicated program for that activity, but it's a critical part of preserving affordable home ownership.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for flagging those bills as well. We know that preserving existing housing often has a smaller impact on the environment than constructing new developments, as we mentioned earlier, which makes preserving housing potentially a more sustainable way to maintain and even expand access to affordable homes. And Sarah Bronin, the Advisory Council, recently released a program comment that touches on housing, as well as sustainability and climate resilience in building and transportation. Can you speak more about what the Advisory Council is working on in this space?
Sure. So this type of document called a program comment is what we characterize as an alternative compliance mechanism for that process that I mentioned, the Section 106 review process. And essentially what the program comment that is currently out for additional public feedback, if anybody's out there and wants to find it on our website, achp.gov, you're welcome to take a look. This current draft that's out covers really any federal action that relates to housing and sets out some pretty clear rules about what federal agencies and their grantees or permittees would be able to do when the Section 106 process is triggered. It is triggered when there is, in this case, in terms of housing, a historic building that's being rehabilitated. So the kinds of things that we've put into the program comment include greater flexibility for moving around interiors, the ability for federal agencies to upgrade mechanical systems, a green light to replace appliances that are more energy efficient, the ability to very clearly remediate for environmental hazards such as lead, asbestos, and radon, particularly in those areas where there are no effects that could be seen from what we would in historic preservation call a primary space or on a facade that has historic significance. So what we're trying to do with this program comment is to green light those activities that should not be considered adverse effects to historic properties, to identify those, and to then also have a second category of activities where there might be some review, but that can proceed again according to some standard steps. So I'm hopeful that the program comment, which has benefited significantly from public feedback and from tribal consultation already, will be reviewed and reviewed carefully by our members, by members of the public, by our tribal governments that to which we owe government to government consultation, and that we will ultimately come out with a better product that we can move forward in service of providing housing and in service of converting existing buildings to housing. These are very arcane rules, by the way, but something that is important for us to tackle for our part as preservationists.
Absolutely, and thank you for explaining the detailed nature of what a program comment is and how important it is, because it really is critical, and thank you for that. I want to make sure we talk about rural communities' housing preservation needs in particular. And so I'll pose a question to Sarah Mulseed, but anyone should feel free to jump in if you have thoughts. And just really want to open it up. What are some of the unique preservation challenges facing housing stock in rural areas? And what tools exist to help respond to these challenges?
Sure. So in our office, we see a number of kind of challenges that are much more likely to be seen in a rural environment than in an urban environment, even though there are public housing units across the country in both sorts of communities. Really what we see is that in a more rural environment, it's almost as much of a capacity issue as anything else, because there are fewer people, fewer experts, fewer oftentimes resources that are available, especially in our smaller states that might not have as much low-income housing tax credit authority that is available to them. So they may be able to do 1 or 2 tax credit projects a year sometimes, as opposed to our larger states that can do much more volume than that. But it's also, there's a lot of very small agencies out there, maybe a public housing authority or a small multifamily owner that might have 1 or 2 projects. And when you have such a small portfolio, it can be difficult to attract talent. It can be difficult to retain talent. It can be very difficult to wade through the complexity that comes along with federally subsidized housing in a number of ways. And so the tools that we've focused on to really help our rural stakeholders as well, one tool that we like a lot is called the Small PHA Blend in our Rad program. And that's a program or kind of a part of Rad that allows small PHAs that have less than 250 units to come in and have streamlined processing in order to convert their subsidies from either mod rehab or public housing or 202. Or this is particularly in public housing, I guess. But in order to convert those public housing programs over to either project-based rental assistance so that they have a direct contract with HUD and it can cut out some of the complexities, or into project-based vouchers so that for those agencies it can reduce the number of programs that they may be administering. And through that, they are also allowed to utilize some of our rent boosting mechanisms in order to increase the revenue that can be available to those programs and to access private capital in order to undertake necessary repairs. And so through that small PHA blend, we find that to be an extraordinarily effective way to reach out to our rural communities and to kind of, again, just combine and cut down on administrative complexities. The other thing that we've really been trying to do is to really get out there and figure out where our mod rehab projects are. Mod rehab is a source of federal, it's kind of a program that is in between all of our other programs. It's not public housing, but it's not quite Section 8 vouchers. It's something in between. So it's a project-based subsidy that gets renewed on an annual basis and that is administered by public housing authorities. And for a long time, because it had been administered by public housing authorities, in our office, we weren't even sure how many projects were out there and where they were exactly. And so we just did a big information collection to identify where our mod rehab programs are and owners are. And we're trying to bring those projects into the Rad program as well so that they can convert to a long-term HAP contract. And many of our mod rehabs are in more rural areas. And so through converting into a longer term assistance contract, they can access more private capital. They can make sure that they're taking care of the recapitalization and other rehab needs, and also ensure the affordability of those projects for the long term. So those are just kind of a couple of the tools that we have, although we've been focused on really trying to help our constituents in our more rural and non-metro areas in the last few years.
And Kristen, I also wanted to chime in here. I +1 to everything Sarah just said, and just want to make sure folks are also aware that the USDA Rural Housing Service, that there's a part of agriculture that since really the last since 1963 for the Section 515 program has been producing affordable rental housing in smaller towns. A lot of those properties are at risk, and in fact there was 28,000 rental properties developed alone under the Section 515 program since the early 60s. At its peak, it had over 500,000 units. So that's, over probably millions of people being housed in affordable, decent, safe conditions in rural America. We have been doing a lot of work with Congress to make sure that USDA has additional authorities to better preserve this existing rental housing stock. The current rules of the road are that you've got a discounted loan from the government, and then they overlaid a project-based rental assistance program similar to HUDs, but not the same, to keep rents affordable. Unfortunately, under law, when the mortgage goes away, so does the rental assistance, and that's a double whammy. That means that the property then doesn't have affordability restrictions often, although it can for a little bit longer. But then, really importantly, from a tenant perspective, they lose that source of rental assistance to help them keep them stably housed. But thankfully, there's a really bipartisan bill that we're big fans of in the Senate called the Rural Housing Service Reform Act. Almost the entirety of the Senate Banking Committee between Republicans and Democrats are on this bill. And one of the hallmark provisions is it in some ways would replicate what Sarah is describing with the Rad program. So what it would allow is that for the rental assistance, the project-based rental assistance to continue after the mortgage is gone, and for that to be able to leverage private debt and equity through the low-income housing tax credit. So you'd have an easier transaction. It would lower a lot of the complexities right now in 515 preservation work, and really kind of modernize the program to where a little closer to where HUD is and the programs that Sarah's describing. So if folks on the webinar haven't checked it out, and I would strongly encourage you to review that bill. There's also some really good single-family provisions that would modernize some of their single-family homeownership programs.
Well, thank you both. That's extremely helpful information. I want to keep talking about RAD for a moment. As Sarah Mulseed, you alluded to in the beginning of the conversation, we know that the RAD program works to address both finding financing and more sources of capital, and also to preserve the physical aspect of the rental units for both public housing and mod rehab. So did you have anything else you'd like to explain to our audience in terms of how RAD works to improve both the physical and financial quality of rental units, and also share any updates on the impact, that information gathering you were talking about? Just wanted to open that up to you.
Sure, absolutely. So as I noted, the RAD program, through the RAD program, we work with public housing authorities and also private owners to essentially take the subsidy that is provided to them under Section 9 of the 1937 Housing Act and convert that over to Section 8 of the 1937 Housing Act. And kind of some key principles in there is that the Section 9 funding is based on a formula, and it is given every year, and it can go up and down, basically based on appropriations in that particular year. However, once we're able to convert that subsidy through the RAD program and enter into a long-term Section 8 contract, then the property has a set rent that it gets every year, and that rent is inflated by an operating cost adjustment factor. And so it provides those projects and those owners of those projects, which in the public housing space do need to remain either public or nonprofit ownership, so that we're not, RAD often is called a privatization program, but we really are keeping the public housing, or the public and nonprofit ownership of the public housing stock. And it allows those owners to really go out and then leverage those long-term contracts in order to secure debt, to secure equity, and also to ensure the continued affordability of those units. I think there are a lot of estimates in terms of the backlog of capital needs in our public housing stock, and anywhere from $30 billion up to $100 billion of backlog in that public housing stock, which is the housing that serves, those of the lowest means possible. It's often, the housing that you can get that is the most important for folks that have the least resources. But if it has that level of capital backlog, it's in danger of being lost forever, or to have extraordinarily poor living circumstances in some ways. And so through the RAD program, we've actually been able to unlock over $19 billion of private capital to start chipping away at that backlog, which is a huge improvement. So for every dollar of public housing funding that has gone into RAD projects, we've actually been able to secure $17 of private capital to help augment that, which means we're making that many more improvements and making sure that the housing lasts for that much longer, because we really are taking care of those physical needs. The other thing that we really pride ourselves on is that we have a very robust program of resident rights to ensure that the residents that are living in these projects are not displaced, that they're not forced out, that they really have the right to return and the right to remain in these developments, so that their units are preserved for them as well as for future residents that may live there. So we're very excited about those numbers. In total, over the last 10 years of the RAD program's existence, we've actually preserved over 200,000 homes, and that equates to actually more than 500,000 residents that have been benefited by the units that have either been improved and preserved through the RAD program.
Wow, that's very impressive numbers. Thank you for sharing those.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to remind our virtual audience that you can submit questions using the chat function. We have a few more questions here, and then we'll turn to the audience Q&A. I want to turn to conversation about how to use the tax code to support preservation. And I believe the congressman might have mentioned this, but federal policymakers have proposed a new tool using the tax code, which is a tax credit to support investment for rehab of owner-occupied homes, as the low-income housing tax credit has done for rental housing. And this is called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, and that proposed tax credit would support the construction and rehab of an estimated 500,000 homes over the next decade. So I'll open this question up to anyone on the panel. And why is a tax credit like this needed? And how could it work with other government programs to preserve affordable housing?
Yeah, I can. Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
Sure. I'll maybe jump in here just to say, there are a number of really innovative tax credit ideas that have come before Congress. And this one sounds like one of the, again, creative ideas to try to marry a lot of different goals. I will point out too, as we go into, what did he call it? The tax extravaganza of 2025. Conversations that will cover existing tax credits as well, including the historic rehabilitation tax credit that the congressman mentioned and that I mentioned just really briefly. The Advisory Council, in its role advising Congress, has often said that the rehabilitation tax credit presents one of the most important tools for moving forward projects that have those multi-layered goals, including in many cases the revitalization of a community asset and the provision of housing. I think the idea is to help to harmonize that tax credit with the low-income housing tax credit. There's some technical fixes that I understand that the congressman is interested in pursuing and that have been proposed in prior Congresses. And just to say that from the Advisory Council's perspective, as we look at our 24 members, 10 federal agencies, 11 direct individual presidential appointees, and 3 historic preservation organizations, we've almost always gone to Congress to support these kinds of bills. In fact, today we had our triennial business meeting and we voted to support, to give our support to another bill as well that revitalizes Main Streets and does that hand in hand with a new tax credit that would work with the existing historic rehab tax credit. So I think, preservationists generally applaud these measures and see them as vitally important to providing that really last funding gap, to closing the funding gap for projects that sometimes can be challenging, especially when you have a building that has been abandoned for a couple of decades and somebody has a vision and sees the possibilities. So we're very supportive generally of these kinds of ideas.
Thank you.
And Kristen, I wanted to add as well that, for Lisk, the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act is our by far our biggest affordable homeownership priority, and we work in coalition on this. There is no targeted federal support like we have on LIHTC for the supply side for affordable homeownership projects. And it's really been modeled, I think rightfully so, on the success of the low-income housing tax credit. So administratively, it functions similarly how it's written in the legislative text. And it's designed for folks that aren't aware to support either the rehab or new construction of affordable homeownership projects in economically distressed communities. And you may ask, well, why is that needed? But the reason is because in those communities, you often have an appraisal gap. The cost to rehab or build a property exceeds what you can sell it for. And this is not just in low-income urban communities. This is very prevalent in low-income rural communities. And there's no subsidy to cover that gap, that appraisal gap. And you can't build scale in this sector without dedicated subsidy, because then you're just raising your hand on an annual basis for private funders or others, which doesn't really allow you to get to scale on the need. So Neighborhood Homes is this targeted support to only cover the appraisal gap over a 5-year period, and it's only available once an income qualified family takes residency of that home. And it has tremendous bipartisan support, I think, because of the prevalence of this problem broadly. And so it's great because it's both a way to get new affordable homeownership supply in the market. It's a way to preserve existing affordable homeownership for low-income households. And if you think about it, it's also a neighborhood revitalization strategy. The more we can bring properties back up to code or build new affordable homeownership in economically distressed communities, that's the sort of catalyst that also serves as a broader kind of stimulus for neighborhood revitalization. So we're big fans of it.
Thank you. Okay, one more question. I want to leave some time for audience Q&A. And this is continuing on our tax policy conversation. And next year, with the expiration of the many provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, several of you mentioned different tax provisions, the historic tax credit, new market tax credit, opportunity zones. Are there improvements that could be made to these programs to better support housing preservation?
Well, I can kick it off, and then if others want to chime in, I think yes. So we've talked about the low-income housing tax credit, Kristen. We've talked about how we need the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, and we're going to be working in coalition and partnership with our friends on the Hill and others to hopefully see that through in the tax package early next year. We also need permanency for the new market tax credit. A lot of folks, when you think of new markets, you don't often think of housing, and in fact, it really can't be used on the rental side. But because we don't have dedicated subsidy like I was describing, like a Neighborhood Homes Investment Act yet, the new market tax credits can be used for owner-occupied housing. It's not the most prevalent use of the program, but there are certain models that are becoming more well understood in the new markets community, and a lot of Habitat for Humanities and other developers have used this more shallow subsidy program for that purpose. But new markets doesn't have permanent authorization in the tax code. And in fact, it expires in 2025. We're grateful just earlier today, our friends at the CDFI Fund released the funding notice for the combined rounds. But we need permanent authorization for the program. We need that to continue so we can continue to support owner-occupied and other community development projects in low-income communities.
Thank you, Mark. Sarah or Sarah, would you like to add anything? Okay. All right, well, I'm going to open up our questions from the audience here. We have a question about conversion of unused sites into housing. It says, I just opened my company and am diving into the world of transforming unused sites into affordable housing for low-income Americans. How could someone go about starting a project like this? Are there things to consider when selecting sites, and what's the conversion process like? So this is more of a practitioner question, but also I'm sure some policy details in there as well.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in and say if the property is a historic building, there's some opportunities that we've talked about both at the federal level and sometimes at the state levels as well to have government step in and again close that gap through tax credits or through other financing mechanisms. I'll also just suggest, and just wearing my other hat briefly, my zoning hat, that zoning can play an important role as to how easy it is for you to start that conversion process. So I wasn't clear whether you had a site in mind or whether you were selecting a site, but I would encourage you to visit, it's a free resource at zoningatlas.org, and put your address in, the addresses that you're considering, and check out whether you can build multifamily housing as of right in those areas. One of my great hopes, and actually something we included in the Historic Preservation and Housing Policy Statement for the agency, is that we all take a closer look at zoning and whether zoning actually enables folks on the ground like you to make a good decision to start a project in a site. And sometimes that will mean local governments making decisions about rezoning sites that maybe were formerly manufacturing or maybe formerly office park for more housing. And the more we see that happen, whether you want to jumpstart that conversation in your community or you can focus on sites that are already rezoned for housing, the more we see that highlighted in the development conversations, I think the better. So those are a couple of things that I would consider as you start your business, and congratulations for doing that.
I would add on to that, it's a good time to get to know your state and local representatives in the housing area generally. If you are looking to do affordable housing that is subsidized, that will have to happen on a local level because HUD currently is not issuing new project-based subsidies. But to get to know your local PHA and what programs they may have, there may be project-based vouchers that are available that would be a source of project-based subsidy for your tenants and residents. And if you're not looking for project-based assistance or subsidy, get to know your local HFA, which would run the local tax credit program. A lot of times, the housing finance agencies, they will issue their what are called QAPs, which are their documents that kind of set forth how they will allocate their tax credits in the state in any given year. And oftentimes those are going to have state priorities in terms of site selection. So how close it should be to a grocery store, how close it should be to transportation routes, those types of things. And so getting to know the government players on the state and the local level is going to be extraordinarily important when you're looking at what sites might be the most eligible for funding.
Thank you. Another question we have here about policy. What are the keys to crafting policies that can gain rural, urban, and suburban support? And I would just, ask you to frame your response in terms of preservation.
We've seen that preservation is really a bipartisan issue. If you look at the Historic Preservation Caucus in Congress, it's led by members of both parties. If you look at the legislation that Congressman LaHood spoke about, bipartisan support. And so I think really the essence of what preservation is community revitalization, especially of assets that the community has recognized are important, both for telling the story of the community, but also visually to connect us sort of visually with the past. So I see from our position in the federal government, the great benefit that we have in terms of building consensus for policies that support affordable housing conversions and historic preservation and revitalization, just because of the essence of what it is. Everybody wants a beautiful, fulfilling community where the buildings are vibrant and alive. And I think that's something that across party lines we have tended to agree on, not just this legislative session, but it really for decades. And that's, I think, the beauty of this particular aspect of housing.
I would agree and say that, to build off that affordable housing doesn't know ideological lines. And I think, all of us can agree that it's both cheaper, more efficient, better use of subsidy to keep what we have. Otherwise, we're leaking. And, if we're losing units while we're producing new, we're usually going to be losing more than we're producing new because the replacement cost of housing has only gone up. And I think that message is bipartisan at its core, and why Representative LaHood and others can have the most bipartisan tax proposal, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. Just to call it one provision, just lowering the bond test from 50 to 25% would greatly help. It sounds wonky, but it would free up so much more credits to preserve affordable rental housing for the nation's lowest income households. And that the bond cap issue, that's also becoming much more bipartisan. It affects both states run by Democrats and Republicans. And I think that's why you're seeing such tremendous support broadly, and why affordable housing was such a big part of both campaigns in the recent presidential election.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to our panelists for making the time and sharing your expertise with our virtual audience. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please feel free to subscribe to our housing newsletter to stay up to date on future events and resources on housing policy. With that, thank you again so much to our panelists for participating and to our audience for tuning in. Have a great day.